everybody, let's talk about how to answer everybody's favorite job interview question. Do you have any questions for us? That's right, questions to ask the interviewer. This is something that they ask you right at the end of most job interviews, and there's one really cool thing about this question, and that is that it can be a litmus test of how you did in the interview. If you're wondering how you did in the interview, this is the question where you can maybe get some indications of if you passed or you failed. Okay, let me explain. So the problem with this question is that they ask it right at the end of the interview, usually after they've completed their interrogation of you, whether you've had a chance to speak freely in the interview or you haven't. Usually they save this question for last as a formality. Now, if you start asking them questions and they seem to be really receptive to answering your questions, and they make time for them and they answer them in full and complete detail, and they don't seem to mind talking at length to answer your questions, that is usually a good sign. If, on the other hand, they ask this question as more of a formality at the end of the interview, and, when you ask them some questions, they don't really seem to be that into answering them. They give you brief, curt answers, and they just seem to want to get to the end of this process so that they can end the interview. That usually suggests that it didn't really work out all that well. So you have to be good at reading body language to determine this, but it is possible to get this kind of feedback in the interview. And I know that a lot of people, it really matters to them. So let's talk about this question. If they should prompt you for questions, which they usually will at the end, don't say you don't have any questions. If you say no when they ask you, do you have any questions? That can be bad for you. Usually what it means is that if you don't have any questions, you could be uninterested in the job, which is bad for you. They will regard you in a negative light. It could be that you didn't do any preparation for the role ahead of time, so you don't really have any questions, which can be also bad for you at the same time. Or it could indicate that you are desperate for a job and you don't really mind which job you're applying to. You just need something. And in their eyes, if you don't ask any questions when prompted, it could suggest that too. And that's a negative for you also. So we always want to ask questions when they prompt this at the end of the interview. I recommend you ask 3 is probably a good rule of thumb, or a rule of 3 fingers, depending on how you look at it. Okay, so what questions can you ask? Well, there's several to choose from. The obvious one is, how has this position become available? Right? That's a pretty traditional question. And that can gain you some insights into the role, which is always good. Even at the end of an interview, if you find something else out about the role, that is still an opportunity for you to speak to that new thing that you just discovered. So if the role requires certain skills or will be doing certain duties, this is good that you're finding it out, because you can slip in the fact that, I have experience with that, or, I enjoy doing that. Little things that will give you those extra points right at the end of the interview. So asking about the role is always good. Some other questions you could ask are, where do you see this industry going? Where do you see this company going? Where do you see this role going in the future? Okay, those are all good questions you could ask. Challenges. You could ask, what challenges do you see ahead for the person in this role? Or what challenges do you see ahead for this company? Or what challenges do you see ahead for this industry? Those are all great questions to ask too. You could ask more personal questions of the interviewer. You could say things like, what's the thing that you most enjoy about working here? And get some insight that way. Or if you feel particularly adventurous, you could say, if you were the CEO of this company, what would you change about it? Now, I don't know if I would universally recommend that question, because you're never really going to get a super honest answer out of them. But it is something you could ask if you have a lot of rapport with the interviewer. Okay? You could ask, what is a typical day for someone in this role? What would a typical day for someone in this role involve? And that can yield some insights into the role itself. And once again, this is a good thing because it gives you the ability to speak to anything that you discover about the role and get those little extra points right at the end. Another question you could ask is, what would you change about this company or this role if you had the opportunity to? That's a little more of an exotic question, but if you have good rapport with the recruiter, that can actually be something that's quite thought-provoking. You could talk about expectations. This would be a good thing. You could say, if I were in this role, what would be your expectations for me after the first 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days? And that also gives you insight into the role and allows you to speak to a couple of those points and get some extra points right at the end. Another great question that if you want to pull this one out is you could say, well, if you could tell me, according to you, what types of people are generally successful in this role, right? Reveal some insight about the role, allows you to speak to it. It's always good. And finally, the other more exotic question you could ask, maybe if you're at a slightly higher level, you're not going for entry-level jobs, but if you're going for maybe a management type job, is you could ask, are there any things that you've seen in other candidates that you haven't yet seen in me that I could perhaps speak to? A little bit more of a direct way of sort of asking about what you might have missed during the interview, and it gives you the opportunity to sort of fill in those blanks right at the end and get some extra points. So those are great questions to ask. The absolute final question that everybody should ask in any kind of job interview is this: where do we go from here? You should always ask that question at the very end of your job interview. You could do it while you're shaking hands. You could do it while you're bumping elbows or doing a chest bump or whatever the industry standard is for your industry. That's a great time to ask this question: where do we go from here? Because you would like to know what the next steps are. Are they going to be contacting you? When will they have a decision? Will you have to reach out to them, or you'll have to check a website or something to determine if they made a decision? It would be good to know that, right? So it's great to ask this question while you're in the interview, while you still have contact with these people. It's a great thing. I recommend that you ask 3 questions. If you ask at least 1 question about the role, that's really good. If the 3rd question is always, where do we go from here? That's good. And the first question, you can pick whatever appeals to you. So hopefully that makes sense. Those would be some great things to say when they ask you, do you have any questions for us? And never ever say no. You guys are awesome. I'll see you on the next video. Take care.